The shiur that I gave this last Shabbat, Parashat Vayigash, seems to have had a profound and important impact on so many people who've asked me to make a recording of it and make it available for distribution. So I do hope that you find some meaning in this and are able to share it with others who might find meaning in it too. The shiur was particularly important coming at the time that we're all feeling so deeply saddened and worried, concerned about the fires raging in Los Angeles and the effect that that's having on the society there. On more than that, it really is a world event. And when I think of world events, it's important that we learn from world events. We learn not only from the texts of Torah, but a ben Torah, somebody who studies the Torah, uses the Torah as a lens through which to look at world events and to learn from world events. And there've been a string of world events since the beginning of 2020, I guess, is the time where we started with the pandemic. That's a once in, not even in a lifetime, it's a one in a few centuries type of event that took place, a global event of the scale of COVID and the way it affected the world. And then right after that, we had October the 7th. That was a world event that shifted the world, changed the world, is busy changing the world, and the war that followed it. In between, we had the war in Ukraine, a European war, which has had enormous impact on the world. And right now, these fires in the most visible city of the world, Los Angeles is a city that's viewed more than any other city in the entire world, one of the most important and leading cities in the world, and to have the whole world's attention riveted on the tragedy that's happening there, that's also a world effect. And if we look at what these world events have been doing and how they've been developing, and to try and gain some kind of understanding from them if we're able to, starting with COVID. Some of you might remember shiurim that I gave at the beginning of COVID, talking about the fact that it's teaching us to lose confidence and trust in institutional structures, and to realize that their ability to take care of us is minimal. And that at the end of the day, it's our level of bitachon, it's our level of relationship to Hashem, it's the centrality of God in our lives that makes the difference and gives us stability. And this is something we were able to learn. I don't know to what extent we've retained those lessons and to what extent they've disappeared and dissolved into the distant past. But that certainly was something we started learning during the COVID period. And then there were other world events. The election of Joe Biden as President of the United States, that was miraculous in the sense that I've often defined miracles as an important event, the odds of which are very low and the stakes of which are very high. And when something happens that one wouldn't really have predicted under normal circumstances, a man of the age of Joe Biden to have been elected at that particular time, and that was important. It was important not only because of some very important decisions he made in favor of Israel. We had difficulties with his administration during the war period as well. But there were some very important moments when his participation in what was happening in Israel was crucial. But there was something else going on that was really important. He had a relationship with Ukraine, I guess a questionable relationship with Ukraine, but enough of a relationship to commit him to deeply supporting Ukraine in the Russia-Ukraine war. And you might say, well, what does that got to do with the Jewish people? Why is that important? Well, it's important because it exhausted Russia. Had Russia been able to conquer Ukraine very quickly, they would have been able to turn their attention to the Middle East when the Middle East flared up. They would have been able to turn their attention to Syria when Syria collapsed. They would have been able to help Iran when Iran was under attack by Israel. But Russia had become so exhausted by these years of war, sustained by the Biden administration. So to have Russia out of the picture when we needed to take care of the Middle East, that was miraculous. That was a nes. And then following that with Trump's election and what everyone's opinion is about that, it's unusual. It's something one wouldn't have predicted in normal times, but may play an important part in the unfolding of history. I've mentioned that a man I became familiar with many years ago before he was famous was Eckhart Tolle, one of the New Age gurus now. But at that time, he'd just written one book, which was The Power of Now. And in the beginning of that book, he talks about the fact, or he writes a little piece right in the title page, you are part of the divine unfolding of the universe. That's how important you are. And that idea of you, each individual, is part of the divine unfolding of the universe. We're watching that more than any other time. I felt like these last 5 years of having the privilege of living in Eretz Israel, living in Israel, has been like a period of having a front row seat in one of the most important ball games of the year, watching world events through the lens of Torah, which is much easier to do in Israel, where one's out of all the noise in the rest of the world and one is able far more effectively to focus on what's really happening. What is it really about? And we've watched these world events one after the other. And then after October the 7th, the way that things have unfolded in the Middle East, the collapse of Hezbollah, the collapse of Iran, hopefully, the collapse of Syria, the map of the Middle East is so different. The geopolitical makeup of the Middle East is so very different. And we're watching all of this unfold. And the fires in Los Angeles are part of this in some way. And I guess we're still trying to work out in what way. But what I am very conscious of is that we had a wonderful visit to Los Angeles only a few weeks ago with family and with friends. And we were able to see the rich Jewish life that is taking place there. The learning of Torah, the institutions that have been established, the wonderful people in the various different communities, all doing well and prospering in every way. The one concern that I couldn't help having while I was there and subsequently was the Jewish community of Los Angeles seems to be a little too complacent. The United States is the only place in the world where Jews still feel complacent and safe. And not all over the States. In Canada, that's no longer the case. And in their parts of the States, and there are some Jewish people who don't feel safe and complacent. But by and large, I met so many people in Los Angeles who said, we live in our bubble and life is wonderful. I have no plans of going on Aliyah or anywhere else. Everything is just amazing. And I know, and we've often talked about it in Shiurim, that Jews have flourished in the Golah, outside of Israel, when they feel somewhat insecure. The dangerous time is when we feel secure in the Golah. And I thought to myself, and as I was preparing the shiur a week ago, that was well before the fires had started, and you'll see from the content of the shiur why I was going in that direction. I was saying to myself, what needs to happen in the United States, particularly what needs to happen in Los Angeles for the Jews to begin to lose their hold on the city, on the place, in the sense of we're here forever, we're comfortable, everything is amazing. And the Jews of Los Angeles and the other Jewish communities in the United States have been enormously philanthropic and enormously charitable in their support of Israel and of institutions of Torah. It's not as if there's anything lacking in their commitment to Yiddishkeit, to Torah, to Eretz Israel. They are wonderful people, enormously committed. But is there a way, perhaps, for them to feel a little bit less invested in where they are? Is a thought that was crossing my mind only a week ago, only a few days before the fires started, and looking at now what a different place Los Angeles is, how differently people feel about everything. How can one come out of such an event unaffected by it, unchanged by it in one's value system, in the way one sees the world? Clearly, Los Angeles will not be the same city ever again. It will be different. It will be marked. It will be scarred. There will have been trauma, and people hopefully will come out of it greater people, and the city will be a greater city, but certainly not the same. Which leads us into the Medrash at the beginning of Parashat Vayichi, the opening verse of Vayichi, the last chapter, the last parsha of the great book of Genesis, of Bereshit, is Vayichi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt, Sheva Esrei Shana, for 17 years. Vayihi Yemei Yaakov Shnei Chayav, and the total length of Yaakov's life was Sheva Shanim V'Arba'im U'Me'at Shana, 147 years. That's how the verse opens up. And it's on this that the Medrash says, Vayichi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, lama parsha zu stuma mikol haparshiot. It's interesting how the Torah is laid out, and this was decided by Ezra HaSofer a long time ago, in the time of the Tanakh already, as to how the Torah would be written, and the way it's laid out is such that this is the only parasha that doesn't start with a new line. It's the only parasha that doesn't start with a new paragraph. In fact, there isn't even a space between the previous Parasha Vayigash and the Parasha Vayechi. It flows on as if it's one parasha altogether. Explains the Medrash, Kivan sheniftar Avinu Yaakov, it's to teach us that when Yaakov died, which is what is being dealt with at this transitional moment between Vayigash and Vayechi, Hitchila Shibud Mitzrayim al Yisrael, that's when the slavery of the Jewish people in Egypt began, which is strange in a way because the parasha tells us in Shemot that Vayakom melech hadash asher lo yada et Yaakov, a new king arose who didn't know Yosef. That king arose after Yosef died, probably some time after Yosef died. Yosef lived for another 70 years after his father Yaakov died. So why would the Medrash be saying that the slavery, which started a century later, was actually starting now at the time that Yaakov died? What is the Medrash trying to teach us? Now, if we look at the Medrash started off with a question about the layout of the writing. So the question is, why does the first verse of Vayechi flow on from the last verse of Vayigash? Which means the key to understanding what the Medrash is saying, the key to understanding why the slavery started when Yaakov died, lies in the last verse of Vayigash, not in the first verse of Vayechi. In fact, that last verse of Vayigash is a bridging verse. It belongs both to Vayigash and Vayechi. It bridges from the story of Vayigash into the story of Vayechi. So what do we find that is a key? What do we find that can resolve the difficult issue that we're dealing with? Why is the death of Yaakov the beginning of the slavery? Where do we see that? And if you look at the words, it says, Vayeshiv Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. That last sentence in Vayigash is, and the Jewish people lived in the land of Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, in the province of Goshen, Vayei achzuva, vayifru vayirbu umod. And they possessed it and were very fruitful and multiplied and very prosperous. But that word vayei achzuba doesn't really mean and they possessed it. Because if you look at the word carefully, you'll notice that that word is written in the passive form. Vayei achzu is not vayochzu. Vayochzu would mean they took possession of it. Vayei achzu means they were possessed by it. And we see that, in fact, in Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, where it says in the Hebrew translation, Ne'echzu v'ne'esru lekarka, they were possessed, they were held down to the land of Egypt. It's not about them holding Egypt. It was about Egypt holding them. It was not about them capturing Egypt. It was about them being captivated by Egypt. And that was the beginning of the slavery. The beginning of the slavery was not Pharaoh enslaving them. The beginning of the slavery was they choosing to be captivated and enslaved by the attractiveness and the comforts of Eretz Mitzrayim. Don't forget, they were living a very full and wonderful Jewish life. Their brother was the prime minister, was the viceroy, the head of Egypt. They were being treated as princes. Their business interests were flourishing. They had batei medrash and yeshivas, as we know. They were learning Torah. They were teaching Torah. They were living a wonderful life. And there's a criticism of them, which the Klei Yakar actually points out and says, Kol pasuk zeh b'ashmat b'nei Yisrael hu medaber. This last verse of Vayigash actually talks in criticism of the Jewish people. Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu gazar, because Hashem decreed ki geir yeh zaracha, that you will be an alien in a foreign land. Vehema bikshu lihyot toshavim b'makom shenigzar alehem geirut. And they sought to be citizens in a land to which Hashem had sent them as aliens, as residents, not as citizens. And he goes on to say that blame is in fact the beginning of the Shi'ibud. That's in fact when it started. Ad shehutzrach HaKadosh Baruch Hu lehotziem misham biyad chazaka, until Hashem had to pull them out of Egypt with an outstretched arm, with a strong arm. Why did God have to be so strong-armed? We've always assumed it's because Paro was so mighty and Paro held them in Egypt against their will. No, says the Klei Yoko. The real reason God had to create that situation of the shibud, of the slavery, and then the 10 makot, the 10 plagues, in order to bring them out miraculously, the reason for all that drama is because they had chosen to be vayachzu, to allow themselves to be captivated by the charming life of Egypt at that time. We know there were a whole lot of people who even after that didn't want to leave and stayed, and they died during the 3 days of darkness. Explains the Klei Yakar based on that key word in the last pasuk of Vayigash, which is also the bridging verse for Parashat Vayechi, Vayachzu, they were captivated by Egypt. That is the beginning of the shibud, and that's what the Medrash says when it says, Kivan sheniftar avinu Yaakov, hitchilu shibud Mitzrayim al Yisrael. It was when Yaakov died, as long as Yaakov was alive, he was able to keep them as a separate community. He was able to keep them directed with the intention of returning to Israel. He was able to keep them with the understanding that they were residents, not citizens, that they were not part of the community of Israel. As long as a Jew lives outside of Israel, as a Jew separate from the land in which he lives, yes, engaged in commerce, engaged in the intellect, engaged in the culture of the host society, making a contribution, philanthropic, and everything the Jewish people do when they're in host societies in countries that are not their own. But the one thing that is critical to keep in mind is a little discomfort. To be there as an alien, to feel this is not my home. It was interesting that when we were contemplating Aliyah, and we were worried, as everybody is who comes, what will it be like? And life is so different. We were living in Los Angeles, as many of you know, and coming from Los Angeles, which not only from a comfort perspective, but even from a values perspective, is perhaps the most diametrically opposite city in the world to Eretz Israel. It is so opposite in every way, and so one worries about making it. And my son-in-law said something really important to me that helped me enormously in making the transition. He said the right time to come to Israel is when you feel deeply that Israel is your home. Because if you feel it's your home, you'll overlook its imperfections. Just as with one's own home isn't necessarily the most beautiful house on the block. One's own home is not necessarily the most spectacular building in the suburb, but it's home. And one wants to be there more than in any other structure because it's home. And if one feels that Eretz Yisrael is home, then the things we have to turn a blind eye to, the things that don't work perfectly, the things that sometimes disappoint us, it's like being at home. At home too, there are cracks in the wall, and there are carpets which aren't perfectly new, and there's furniture which is a little bit used, and there are things that don't work as well as they might work, but it's okay, it's home. And that's what's really important. For as long as one feels home is Los Angeles, or home is London, or home is New York, it's very difficult to make that transition, because Israel doesn't shape up as well as any other country on all the superficial measures of prosperity. It's only when you feel I'm at home here in a way that I can't feel anywhere else that the time has arrived for one to go home, for one to go to the place that one is comfortable. But part of that feeling at home in Israel is feeling not at home anywhere else. And again, feeling not at home doesn't mean that we withdraw. It doesn't mean that we don't engage. It doesn't mean that we're not successful. It doesn't mean that we're not invested. It just means we're not at home. And I so worried during that visit in Los Angeles that the wonderful Jews of Los Angeles felt very, very at home in their amazing communities there, and that was somewhat worrying. We know the famous Meshech Chochmah in Parashat Bechukotai, where he writes in the 1920s, or perhaps a little earlier, about how people were beginning to talk of Berlin as the new Jerusalem, that people were beginning to feel so comfortable in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe as well. There was a sense of Torah was flourishing and the Jews were doing well, that this was home. Jews had been there for hundreds of years and more, and this was home. Over a millennia, Jews had been settled there. Communities were over 1,000 years old. It was a sense that this is home, and he writes how dangerous that is. Because when we start feeling at home in a place, that the story of Jewish history every 100 or 200 years is that a storm comes and reminds a Jew, Yehudiyata, that you are Jewish, you're not part of this society. You're separate from this society. And then the Jews are dispersed to new places. And they put their roots down, and they make a difference there, and they're philanthropic there, and they build businesses there. And after a few decades, once again, they begin to feel that this is home. And again, he says, the danger is that another storm will be necessary to disperse them to somewhere else until eventually they land up in Eretz Israel. They land up in a place where not only do they feel at home, but they land up in a place where they are at home. And as I mentioned, the United States is the last place in the world that Jews still feel at home. And in some ways, we're very thankful and grateful for that. But it's not good for us. The Jews of Europe don't feel at home. Even the Jews of Canada don't feel at home anymore. The Jews of South Africa don't feel at home anymore. Jews in Australia aren't feeling at home anymore. The only place where you still hear Jews saying that they really feel at home are New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and some of the other places, the other wonderful communities of the United States. And it's really necessary for a Jew to feel the discomfort of being a traveler, to feel the discomfort of being out of his or her natural element. And it's interesting, when I visited Yad Vashem many years ago, you go through those picture exhibitions, those photographic exhibitions, Eastern Europe, and moving up till the beginning of the war, till the rise of Hitler and the war itself, and then the rise of the State of Israel afterwards. And you watch this whole movement. It struck me, and the thought has worried me a great deal, that it felt to me, looking at those pictures, that Eastern Europe needed to come to an end. It couldn't just naturally transition into what we have today in Israel. There actually needed to be an end. As important as that period of history was, as vibrant a contribution as it made to the evolution of Torah and to the Jewish people in every way, nevertheless, it had to actually come to an end. It had to, so to say, be destroyed, so that out of that destruction could arise something new and something very, very different. And I only just came across a book that was written by Rabbi Dr. Chagi Stemler, a book called Ayin Ba'ayin, about the philosophy of Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the son of the great Rav Kook. And I don't know very much about Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, but I know many people who were talmidim of his. And in it, he discovers 8 letters that Rav Kook wrote as a young man to Helena Baer, who was a young woman in the family that he stayed with when he visited Halberstadt in Germany during a period of his life. And he became friendly with the family, kept up that friendship all his life, and engaged in some correspondence with Helena, who later came to Israel and headed an ulpana. And one of the things he writes in one of those letters is Befarsha ha'uyumash reshit shnot ha'tafshin, the terrible events of the beginning of the 1940s. Hodati mi'az ki yesh lirot b'zeh yad Hashem. I made known at that time, says Rav Kook, that one has to see in the Holocaust the hand of God. Letahalich chisul v'keitz galutenu. There was a necessary destruction and end to that particular period of galut. Hanituach hanora b'chol gufa shel umatenu. The terrible medical procedure, so to say, that had to take place to eradicate from us that galut. And so the whole body of the Jewish people had to be operated on. Lehe'aker me'achiza ba'artzot ha'amim v'tumatam. To be uprooted from the hold that the nations of the world of that time held over us. And notice the word he uses, me'achizah, the same word as we find in the last sentence of Parashat Vayigash, Vayechzu. We needed to be uprooted from the hold the lands had on us. Not our possession of the lands, not our investment or lives in those lands, but their hold on us. כדי להתחדש ולהישתל ולהתחיות בארץ חיינו, קודשנו, נחלת אבותינו, so as to be renewed and replanted and find renewed life in our holy land, the land of our forefathers in Eretz Israel. To do that, what was before needed to be destroyed. And so it seems clear if we look at the unfolding of history and we say that the United States is the last place where Jews still feel at home, that means it's the last place where we can still expect turmoil to bring about a sense of, you are Jewish people, you are Americans in the sense that you are legally citizens, and I speak as an American citizen myself. And the United States has been enormously important to the Jewish people, particularly over the last 100 years. We have enormous gratitude and appreciation for the United States. But we need to know that we are aliens. We're not really citizens. We're not at home, even in the United States. Even in New York, with all the learning and the Basei Medrash, even in Lakewood, we're not at home. Even in Los Angeles, we're not at home. If we can just feel that we're not at home, we can flourish there, not only physically and materially, but we can flourish spiritually as well, until the time comes to make a move. But if we feel at home, the storm will come, as the Meshech Chochmah says, the storm will come, as Kleachar says, the storm will come, as Rav Kook says, to give us that message of, this is not where you're meant to feel at home. There's somewhere else where you're meant to feel at home. And we need to be conscious of this, and we need to be aware of this, and we need to find within ourselves that capacity. And it's interesting that the ability to look at the world through the lens of Torah, as I mentioned, so much easier from Israel. But the Gedolei Israel who lived, whether in Eastern Europe or in the United States, lived there in the same way as they would have lived if they were living in Yerushalayim or Bnei Brak. If Rabbi Moshe Feinstein would have been walking through the streets of Bnei Brak or Yerushalayim, he would have looked no different. He would have thought no differently. He would have spoken no differently. The same with Ra'anana Kollel, and the same with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and the same with the great lights of Eastern Europe. They lived there in no different way from the way they would have lived in Eretz Israel itself. And I'm not just talking about dress, about outer appearance. I'm talking about their value systems. And if one is living overseas, whether one's living in Los Angeles or in New York or in London or in Paris or in wherever it is that one's living, to be able to live with the mindset of a Torah Jew, to be able to live looking at the world through the lens of the Torah, no matter what, to calibrate one's value systems not by the values around one, and not by the social norms around one, and not by the trends and the fashions around one, but to be able to calibrate one's life according to the principles and the values of the Torah, so that no matter where we're living as a national of Eretz Israel. We're living as Torah Jews. We're living as guests and residents in the lands and the countries in which we find ourselves, but not as citizens who feel at home. Because that amazing feeling of being at home is a feeling reserved for the Jew in only one place, in Eretz Israel. Our hearts go out to the people who are suffering in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Our concern, our tefillot to you, just as we have appreciated your unwavering support of the hardships we've been through in Eretz Israel. And we look forward to bridging our lives even more in the future than in the past. We look forward to your feeling at home in our land, to our being able to welcome you into your own home that is waiting for you for the time when it's right. And for each person and for each family, that time is different. And each family and each individual needs to determine that time. The time is when you start to feel that you're not at home anywhere except in Eretz Israel, the land that is waiting for you with open arms, and a land that doesn't promise you ease, a land that doesn't promise you comfort, but a land that promises you a life of such richness, such warmth and such caring, a land that promises you your home.